Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dairy Raid. And today we're going to take one last look back at spring ball and look back at the defense and what we've learned about the changes to the defense that occurred throughout spring ball and more specifically from the spring showcase. We're entering year 3 of the Luke Fickell / Mike Tressel era, and we are getting what is essentially a systematic reset of the defense. It's not a complete reboot. They're not just going to ditch core defensive philosophies and systematic approach, but we're going to see a lot of changes that are going to hopefully help tailor our defense to the opponents that we're going to see. And why this reset is necessary. It took some time for it to become apparent, but there's really two key things that have driven this reset. First thing, the coaching staff inherited a roster that was recruited to play the traditional Dave Aranda through Jim Leonard 3-4 defense, and yet they were ill-equipped to actually function in that system. So when the current staff came in with the idea of, melding the elite, bringing their philosophy to the old system, it didn't work because the players we had at Wisconsin were not good enough to play in that previous system. And that became apparent as we went forward. And that led to also problems when, especially in year 2, we started playing first, better offenses than we had normally played in the past. I think our defensive glory days were greatly exaggerated when you look at just some of the abysmal offenses that the Badgers had to play and how little actual effort it took to get bowl eligible back in the day and to win the Big Ten West back in the day, playing against such illustrious offenses as the Brian Ferentz era Iowa offenses, the Lovie Smith and previous Iowa or Illinois offenses, bad Purdue teams, etc. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. The conference has changed, and gone are the days where you can recruit players to fit a defensive system. You have to recruit defenders to defend offensive systems. So the defensive philosophy then has to change to match the offensive evolution that is happening in the Big Ten Conference. And we're seeing on a year-to-year basis, we are going to see offenses from power pro style to run first spread to air raid and everything in between. And we have to have a defensive system that is built to match that and to find the inherent flaws in those offenses and then exploit them. So what is that going to lead for the Badgers defense going to this year? Obviously, versatility is going to be the key. The new defensive identity needs to be rooted in multiplicity and flexibility. We need to be able to put different personnel packages out there to counteract what the offense is showing and then be able to attack it. We don't want to just get out there, okay, we match personnel. We were able to match personnel the last 2 years, but we were unable to make plays against those personnel. So at the end of the day, it didn't really matter. So the more rigid structure that has been in place forever, you look back at a lot of the defenses we had in the past, and then going into last year, you saw the same shell the most of the time. And if you play against the same systems every year, you can kind of get away with the shell if you are under talented. If you have more talent than the offense you're playing against, then you can sit in that shell all day and you're not going to have any issues. But this year, that kind of basic shell look is going to change, and it's going to morph depending on the teams that we're going to play against. So let's get in, and we're going to talk about how the new defensive setup is rooted, and then how the coaching staff is going to change things and adjust to personnel as we're going forward. So, like we did last time when we did the offense, I have it set up over here where we can transition. There we go, a little bit better this time. Into huddle, and we're going to talk about the defensive structure. All right, so before we go forward with what we have right now, let's actually go back a little bit and talk where Coach Fickell and Coach Tressel's defensive roots are, and how they're actually going back to those roots by going forward with the Wisconsin defense. So, Luke Fickell and Mike Tressel both came from base 4-3 defensive sets. Ohio State ran, and come on. We're doing it live, people, and I'm not editing this out. Anyways, both teams or both coaches came from base 4-3 defensive structure. Again, Luke Fickell at Ohio State and Luke Fickell Mike Tressel coming out of Michigan State under Pat Narduzzi, and Luke Fickell coming from Ohio State. So we would have a basic setup similar to this. If I can get there we go. All right, so a basic structure, something like this. And actually what they would probably do based on front, we'd switch these backs around. We would go under, and we'd overhang the backer here. All right, so a base 4-3 against whatever personnel. And again, at most times where this base 4-3 had its roots were teams that ran pro style, so I formation. As football evolved, and as Luke Fickell went into a conference in the American where you had so many varied offensive systems, they played everything from power pro style football to the flex bone and air raid and everything in between. So they had to develop a system that was more flexible, and that's where they eventually settled on the 3-3-5. And how the 3-3-5 is what started was your 3-3 stack defense. You saw this back in the day with Joe Lee Dunn at Mississippi State, was a key protagonist in the growth of the 3-3 defense. And so we evolved into a 3-3 stack defense. As Coach Fickell saw, what you lack in a three-man line is that front level, first level pressure and being able to absorb blockers. So what he brought in next is something that I actually saw that evolved from what Dave Aranda's defense turned into, and that was his 4-3 or a 2-4 defense evolved into a 3-3, but with a four-man surface. So we would get a look more like this against a 11 personnel 4-down look, or with a tight end. All right, so we evolved into a system kind of like this, where we would have 3 true defensive linemen, and it depends on the system and the defensive coach. But a lot of times you would have a true edge, a nose tackle, a defensive tackle, a 3-tech, and then a stand-up outside linebacker around. And This is where our starting point is for the new defense that we are seeing here in 2025. And essentially what we are getting is we're going to go back, we are getting your old school, switch these guys around a little bit, your old school 4-3 base defensive looks, but with different personnel packages. So the first one that we saw the most of at the showcase was your 3 down, 3 linebacker nickel look. Okay, and I call this 3 down with 3-3 because in this situation here, our linebacker who's up on the edge, in my system this would be the Sam backer. I believe they call it the Jack backer in their system here. Whatever, I don't really care about personnel right now or how they call it. You'd have a stand-up outside linebacker, 2 defensive tackles, and a defensive end. This is the first personnel package that I saw, and I saw the most of, where we would get a stand-up guy out here. This, a lot of times, was Daryl Peterson. And then interior-wise, you would have guys like Charles Perkins and Parker Peterson, Javier Suggs, those type of guys interior here. And then on the edge, on the backside, on the short side of the field, you would get guys like Corey Walker, Michael Gardner, Charles Perkins would pop out there. But you would have what I would call 3 true defensive linemen. Okay? The next group that I saw the most was the same look here, except our linebacker here put his hand in the dirt. And this is where some confusion has been with Coach Mitchell's group, where he seems like he has 15 guys of about 6 different body types. He's coaching the edges. So the next personnel group that I would see most often would be this 3 down look, but we take that stand-up outside linebacker and we replace him with a hand in the dirt defensive end. Now, this could be someone like a Corey Walker, or this could be Daryl Peterson with his hand in the dirt. Anything like that. But once this linebacker, to me, puts his hand in the dirt, he transitions from being a linebacker who could potentially drop in coverage, and they did drop these edge players into coverage, but only when they had a 2-point stance. When they're in a 3-point stance, they're essentially a down defensive lineman. And to me, now we are in a 4-2 look. Okay? Big difference there. Obviously, this changes how the coverage shell behind is going to function, because now we're not going to have this edge player or either of these edge players getting involved in the coverage. That's fine. A lot of defenses don't do that, and even if he was standing up, they didn't drop them a lot. They only did it situationally, so there's not going to be a huge change there. All right, so that's the second personnel group that we saw. The third one we saw, well, that was your going back to the 2-4. We still saw the 2-4 in various sub-package situations. We saw they opened, I believe it was the second defensive series. They just started out in the 2-4, matching up against the offense when they were in 11 personnel. Obviously, this was going to be more in pass rushing situations where you would get your Sebastian Cheeks, and later in the game you get Clayton out there, and you'd pair them with 2 stand-up outside linebackers instead of having one of them with their hand in the dirt. We also saw someone like Therese Fearbury would get in this, and he was a guy who had both. He could stand up, and they would put him in a 3-point stance as well. So the 2-4 was another group that we saw quite often. When the offense moved into 12 personnel, another position group that we saw was they ran a let's get these guys set. They ran a 3-4. So they would come out, and they would have 2 stand-up outsides, and 3 down, and 3 interior linemen, and they actually would creep up one of these safeties down in the box as well. They ran this in the short red zone and in a short yardage situation, coming out where the offense was in, I believe it was 22 personnel. They came out in this kind of look. It's a lot more like a 5-2. I didn't see any passing reps out of this situation, but what it really looked like was these 2 edge guys were just playing contain. They were playing gap exchange inside and then read and reacting over the top. So 3-4 was another look that we saw. Another one that we saw when they came out in 11 or 12 personnel is they would replace, we'll go back here, they would replace this, out here this would normally be the nickel, and they replaced him with what they were calling the star in their system. So boom, right there. There's our star. This is your old school 4-3 outside linebacker type. And so they would adjust here. A lot of times they paired this with an over front. Or sorry, over would be the other way. I know my defense people, trust me, I do. Okay, so they would pair it something like this, and then they would switch the linebackers. So again, they would be in a look kind of like this with that star. I don't like how little that is, so we're gonna make a new symbol. There we go. Fine. All right, and they would just put this linebacker out in space. He doesn't really have much in terms of crazy pass responsibility. He would basically just play on an island here, kind of in the flat. But in a situation like this, he would be reading the edge, whether it be a tight end or a tackle. And if we got outside zone our way, we would attack the line of scrimmage. If we saw a down block away, he would squeeze. If we saw a pass, he would drop into his pass zone. So they ran this personnel here. This is basically 3-4 personnel. And they would run this look like this, and then they would also take this edge here, the edge linebacker, and put his hand on the dirt and essentially run a 4-3. So all of that, I just said a lot, and I moved a lot of letters on the screen here and talked about what they're doing. All this is to say, we saw a lot of different personnel packages, but it wasn't just being thrown, against the wall and seeing what sticks. You could see the plan. They would start series with certain personnel packages. They would build through it, and as the offense changed, the defense changed. They are working to be able to show versatility. And what I liked about this as well is since the Badgers offense didn't show much in the terms of 10 personnel, we are going to have different defensive substitution packages like the dollar look, I would assume so, and the 2-4 nickel to then have the speed and the versatility to cover more spread out formation. But what they're showing here is a basic structure that then they can change pieces to give different looks to the defense, but we're keeping things in a systematic look. All right, so that is a look at just talking about the changes in the personnel. So let's go back to here and let's talk about what we got next and talk a little bit about how these changes of the personnel led to changes in both pressure and coverage. We're going to start with pressure. One thing that we obviously saw a lot the last couple of years that was a problem is our inability to create pressure with a base look without having to resort to blitzing. And that is certainly changed. I think obviously the emphasis on bringing in pass rushing type edge players, bringing more speed in the linebacking core, and having players whose primary goal is to be a pass rusher is going to influence the pressure systems that are being built by this defensive staff. And then by having a defense where the moving parts are less static, it can create a lot of interesting angles that can be exploited by the new defensive system. So we're going to go back into here, and I'm going to talk about one in particular that I liked seeing. So in the showcase, the offense came out several times in a formation like this. It was a bunch 3-by-1 look that they ran with either 12 or 11 personnel. And how the defense would adjust to this is they would take the nickel and they would align right there. They would usually, with this kind of look, they would switch sides in terms of where they would put that linebacker. So they would be in a look kind of like this. We get the bigger edge, we get the linebacker here, we play the corner, and we would switch the safeties. And I'm going to switch these guys around just so this can make a little more sense in my head. Boundary, and we're going to call him. This is going to be the nickel. All right, so we got our field, we got our boundary. DBs a lot of times were in this shell kind of look, and we're going to talk about how that shell changed as the play started. So what they would do in a situation like this is they came off several times where we would show press here, and then on the snap, we would get a slant here, slant across here. We brought a blitz here, but we would bring a late blitz here, and that's where the true pressure was going to come. And this kind of blitz, it may look like we have two players going in the same gap, and that's true. That is its intent. And I know some of you who's thinking about talking about gap assignment football. It's like you're having two guys in the same gap. That's wrong. And when you're looking at basic defensive structure, that's probably true. But what the benefit of this kind of late blitz, the staggered blitz here, is causing is what you're going to get, especially in a pass rushing situation, is you are going to get two blockers engaged on this slanting defensive lineman, and that is going to allow our blitzer off the edge to excuse me, God, I cannot talk today, to occupy the space that is left over by that movement. And let's say in a situation like this that our edge ends up going outside, and we get our guard here is popping in for the linebacker. Yeah, I don't need to delete him. And we get our tackle coming out here. Well, that's great. Then we can take this guy who's taking our nickel and who's on that track, and instead of going outside, well, then he can go inside. And we saw both of these in the showcase. So this kind of blitz is only possible if we have edge players who have enough, how do I say it, enough skill that they are causing these offensive linemen to have to think about either double teaming or always isolating, putting a man on him. So this was a situation that helped us create late pressure that after the initial movement of the D-line, we're not getting home, that now we can add a second layer to it. And when you're bringing guys with speed, and when you're bringing them from not that far off the edge, you can create issues. So that's one thing we saw. One thing that we also saw a lot of was more movement inside. So we would get slants, and then we would get cross blitzes, which I really like seeing. where we get a leg row coming off of the edge of the defensive tackle slanting, and then we would get Curtis back inside, and vice versa. We would get situations where we would slant our two edges, our edge and our defensive tackle, and we would bring one of these backers off the edge. We saw a little bit more of that, and in combination with the nickels. So a lot more pressure looks in terms of designing pressures. That's one thing. Another thing, obviously, is we just got better pressure from these edge players. And when you can take some of these edge guys and give them a specific roles, like when you're going in to rush the passer. You are highlighting what they're good at while minimizing things that they may potentially not be as good at. All right. So that is talking about the pressure looks that we saw at the showcase. Let's talk a little bit about the change in the coverage philosophy. Now, again, this could be mostly built on designing coverages to match the offense that we saw during spring ball. That could very well be. But when you are starting to bring pressure from different angles, as we are now, that is going to change the emphasis on pass coverage from man to zone, because we need to have the ability to rotate into coverage and use the pressure that's being built off coming off the edges to either bait a bad throw or at least to influence the progression of the quarterback, so then we can make sure that we have pressure set in the correct position. So one thing that we saw a lot of was coverage rotation. And with the rotation, let's get back into here. What we would see is, and let's put the offense in a little more balanced look here just for the sake of argument. So if we get ourselves a look like this, and let's switch the safeties around a little bit. Okay, so we get a balanced look. We saw this a little bit. What we would get is we would get one of these safeties to start rotating down pre-snap, and then we rotate the other safety over the middle. And in a situation like this, we would get either 3 high, cover 3. So we got deep third, deep third, deep third. We'd work these nickels. They would read seam, no threat up the seam. Then they would work hook to curl to flat. And then this rotating down safety would do the same thing. He would be thinking first over the top, and if he got nothing over the top, he would be thinking hook to curl to flat. Inside backers would be thinking wall off the seam to then hook to curl, and then again to flat. We work that redundancy into the system there. So rotating coverage can, one, it allows you to have movement enough that if you need that extra player in the box, you can essentially create an 8-man box on rundowns, and it can give the offenses, false sense in where the holes are going to be. That's one coverage look that we saw. Another one that we saw a little bit more of that I was actually kind of happy to see is what we call palms coverage. And palms is the newer school cover 2 defense. I guess that's the easiest way to put it. So in palms, move this guy out here a little bit. What we are doing here, we're going to talk here on the boundary side first, is our corner and our safety are reading the number 2 receiver. Play that nickel a little bit wider, a little bit deeper. That number 2 receiver. If the number 2 receiver breaks out under the landmark, and in my system, that landmark is about 5 yards. In college, it could be 8. Don't matter. Whatever the landmark is, if he breaks out, and my corner should be playing at 7, Then my corner is going to jump him, and then our safety is going to rotate over the top to number 1. He is working at number 1 deep. Our nickel is working to stay low inside of number 1 to make sure that he can't break across his face back to the middle of the field. So that's where we built some redundancy in a situation like that. If we get a situation where number 2 goes vertical, goes beyond the landmark, then obviously the safety is going to pick him up. Safety's got him everywhere is vertical. He has help inside by our inside linebackers, who again are trying to stay low and inside and force him to go over the top. And then if he eventually breaks out, we would have our nickel, who would be breaking underneath to take away anything underneath of the number 2 receiver. And then our our corner here would have all of number 1. So that is, it gives you the benefit of having your overhang defender actually be the corner, give you a little bit more contain on these outbreaking route, on these quick breaking routes, but it will not give you the same holes that you would find in your traditional cover 2 defense, which would be that hole shot right behind the corner, but in front of the safety. So we saw palms, and then we would see various rotations inside to send pressure and then make sure all of those basic pass zones in the palms or cover 4-ish kind of look were covered. We also saw that with the cover 3. So there was still man coverage, and I think in situations we are going to try to isolate Rico on your offense's number 1 receiver, and we play zone coverage away from that. We try to put one guy on an island, which then affords us to put the rest of the coverage working on the other side. And as your fourth green showed pretty good versatility and has the ability to play man coverage on his side as well. So it's giving us options, but the more we can do in coverage, if we can only do man, that limits what we could do blitz-wise, that limits on how quick we need to bring our blitzes in. But if we can incorporate more zone, more rotation, we're not only going to help us in the passing game, but we're going to allow us to get that extra body down in the box in run situations when we're getting that rotation. All right. So that is a look at some of the coverage changes. And moving on, let's talk a little bit about, again, how we are going to expect these interior players to adjust to a system that is going to have so many players moving around on the outside. So really, there's 2 spots in this new defense, or not new defense, in this new approach to the defense that are going to be a little more static, and that is our 2 interior defensive linemen, our D tackle and our nose. The key thing that's going to change with the interior players in comparison to last season was, last year, the idea was you control your gap. You make a read, you get in your gap, and you maintain the gap. And what we ended up having issues with is the idea of then what? Where, okay, I've controlled my gap, I'm in my gap. Now it's time to move on to our secondary job in that process, and that is now more to attack the football. This is different than the old school idea that we had before, which caused some players to feel like they didn't fit the system, where guys like Kurt Neal thought that their job was just to attack gaps. And we're not just going to be attacking gaps. We need to control gaps, and then we need to find the football. So it's not just controlling the gap. It's not just attacking the gap. It is controlling the gap and finding the football. So for this to work, we need to really make sure that these interior linemen are playing with good leverage, they're playing low, and they are playing with vision and not just attacking and getting into the chest of that offensive lineman. We saw that a lot, again, with guys like Kurt Neal, where they would run straight into that offensive lineman, get good power, get good leverage, and they would just run around the corner. What we need to be able to do is get into that blocker, extend, and then use vision to find the football and make a play without losing our gap. That's going to be key. Now, when we have more players moving around in the defensive backfield, that's going to help us D-line wise, because that hopefully is going to build in redundancy. Whereas the linebackers are flowing over the top, they are going to be looking to flow into the open gaps created by the movement of the defensive line. And then if we get better at filling those gaps, then no matter what gap the defensive lineman ends up in as he's reading the play, we can still cover everything so he can't be wrong. And we need that kind of play. Now, watching our defense play in the spring showcase showed some areas that they need to improve on if we are going to be able to play in a system like this year. Obviously, the benefit or the downside of watching how efficiently our offense ran the wide zone was showing how difficult it can be to defend. And we saw several instances in the showcase where defensive linemen and backside edge guys would hold their position and they would not flow downhill or flow to the football as fast as we need them to on the backside. So we got to be in position that if the ball is flowing away from us, we're controlling our gap and our edge, obviously, but then we need to get downhill or sideline to sideline, not downhill, so we can hit that ball carrier before he gets even with us. So then we can get a situation where he's not going to fall flat away from us. All right? That's very important. Moving on, let's talk about other potential issues that we saw with the second level players. Obviously, now that the linebackers and nickels are moving a lot more and we're using different personnel in there, we need to make sure that they're understanding their role in stopping plays like RPOs, plays like package plays. And we had a couple situations where we had these players kind of pick their poison, and whatever they did was wrong. The offense put them in conflict of assignment, and we need to be able to attack from situations like that, which is why rotating coverage like we have been working on. In fact, let's go back into here and let's talk about a situation that I saw with this kind of look. And let's put, so we ended up having a formation kind of like this, and we had our nickel down on this side, and the offense ran wide zone. Situation like this, wide zone. And we're in sidecar and going across here. And in a situation like this, how we should be fitting, if it's my system, we're fitting here, we're fitting here to here, depending on how the flow is set. Our backside backer would be looking to fit here or here, depending on how the nose tackle fits. And then we squeeze, and then we squeeze and fill. Our safety, our bandit our boundary safety should be coming downhill, and he's fitting off of here. So where this play ended up hitting for the offense was essentially we had the entire defense flowing over and getting outside of the play side guard. And if I can get this to, no, don't do that. There we go. Whatever. Anyways, we had the entire defense basically from the play side A gap out. and the running back came up, hit here, and then banged it back right up that A gap. And Huddle does not want to work with me, but you get the idea. Where this backside fill should have been coming from is, one, our outside linebacker here on the wide side. Because there was movement to get here, or he was expecting movement, he played this very flat, where he played up and then he came out, which is not necessarily wrong, but he needs to play this a little bit more tighter to the edge and then climb from there. Another situation we had there is then when we got the run trigger here, our nickel did not flow and get into the backside cutback, which is where he should have been. Because what did the offense do? Well, they ran, or what did the rest of the guys here? Well, what they basically ran was a seam or a corner and then a little sit down route right in here. And he would, I believe it was Billy Edwards at the time, stared right here and uses eye manipulation to create the issue there. Now, how the defense can get better at this, and I know they will, is we can have, right, in a situation like this, we are 3/2. We are a one-man extra in a situation like this. On the front side here, we're 3/2. Okay, so we're fine. Where the tight end is less of a threat, we're fine. So this is where that coverage rotation can come into play. If we are going to rotate our free field safety down to be the flat defender, so we can rotate our corner over the top like that, and we could play probably palms over on this side. Now we have that hook to curl player here, which can allow our nickel here that when he triggers run, he can fill run and allow him to squeeze that cutback. If we can do that, then what we can have here is we can have this edge player play tighter and play more fill and flow. So he's off the edge, he's getting deepest, and he's tracking. And that is going to allow him to squeeze the wall, squeeze the edge from the backside, and take away the cut, because that's what we're looking for with this. The offense wants you to flow over flow. We put our foot in the ground and we cut. So this coverage rotation is going to be able to help. If we are back in our world of playing man coverage, then this nickel here is essentially, he's got to pick his poison. And whichever one of these two he picks is wrong. And the corner is going to be in a bad leverage position. I never want to play tight man in a situation where we have a condensed look, because all it takes is a switch release here and both players are covered. So we want to be able to play zone, but we need to be able to not only fit the run, but get into the gap there as well. All right, so that's how the changes in the coverage can kind of fill some of the holes that we're seeing in the defensive look. All right, so let's start to wrap things up here and talk about what all of this new changes are going to mean. I think it's going to be vitally important that with as many moving parts as this defense needs to have, and this is not an overcorrection, this is a systematic approach that would have happened regardless of who the defensive coordinator is going to be. You see it with Jim Leonhard and with the defenses he's seeing, or the offenses he's seeing in the NFL, how much the Broncos defense has to change, and that makes his job as a secondary coach that much more difficult and stimulating. But with the way offensive football is changing, defense needs to match in terms of speed. We can still work for power, but that's going to change the idea of the type of personnel. So there needs to be players that fit what we're looking for systematically. Athletes, but more importantly, players who know their job and can fit the role that is being asked from them. We cannot have players freelance. We got caught in a lot of problems last year, especially with the defensive line, when our defensive linemen decided to freelance. And when they did, that's when they got blown up. We had situations where our linebackers were not aggressive enough when they saw their gaps. I think we saw signs at the showcase, especially Christian Allegro, Tackett Curtis, are two players who have gotten way better at getting downhill. Our interior defensive linemen know their role, and that is going to help us slow the bleeding that we've had these last couple of years. Is it going to be a change completely from year 2 to year 3? No, but it's going to be a step in the right direction. Are we going to get back to the days of having defenses that are in the top 5 in all these various defensive categories? No, because we're not playing the same shit offenses that we used to play. Pardon my language. But what we are going to be able to get is a defense that can match personnel and that can attack and create opportunities for turnover. And that's obviously something that we need to grow for. And that is going to become the new defensive identity. We're not going to be a wait and see defense anymore. We're not going to be a defense that relies on a couple superstars or players that take 4 years, 5 years to develop into superstars to lead the defense. We need a defensive system that is going to take young, maybe underdeveloped, but talented players and finding roles for them so they can succeed early, so they stay motivated to stay within the program, but then also lead to success. It's why guys like Nicholas Clayton are going to get on the field early when they're 230 pounds soaking wet, but they have some pep off the edge and can give you some looks as a pass rusher. It's a step in the right direction. So that is a look at what we learned about the defense at the 2025 Spring Showcase and Spring Football overall. As we go through these summer months, we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into the actual execution of these looks as I've had more time to break down the film that I have gotten from the showcase. We could talk a little bit more about the X's and O's. But right now we're thinking systematically. I like the direction we're going, and I'm hoping it's going to be a step in the right direction. All right, so that's going to be it for today. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.